Chapter 7:1 In the German Ideology, Marx observes the situation of German philosophy from the outside. But the outside here is not simply the physical exterior of Germany. For instance, Marx writes as follows: German criticism has, right up to its latest efforts, never left the realm of philosophy. It by no means examines its general philosophic premises, but in fact all its problems originate in a definite philosophical system, that of Hegel. Not only in its answers, even in its questions there was a mystification. This dependence on Hegel is the reason why not one of these modern critics has even attempted a comprehensive criticism of the Hegelian system, however much each professes to have advanced beyond Hegel. Their polemics against Hegel and against one another are confined to this: each takes one aspect of the Hegelian system and turns this against the whole system as well as against the aspects chosen by the others. To begin with, they took pure, unfalsified Hegelian categories such as substance and self-consciousness. Later they secularized these categories by giving them more profane names such as species, the unique, man, etc. What made Marx aware of this was a heterogeneous linguistic system in which German philosophy did not compute. When Marx writes, this alienation, to use a term which will be comprehensible to the philosophers, by the philosophers he means precisely the German philosophers, suggesting that he already saw and theorized things from a place where the term alienation had ceased to function. Marx's style begins to noticeably change after the German ideology. If a thinker changes, their style follows suit. If the theoretical content changes, but the style remains the same, it is no real change at all. To break with Hegel is to break with Hegelian terminology. Heinrich Heine, who Marx was personally close to in Paris, displayed a style alien to the young Hegelians in his On the History of Religion and Philosophy in Germany. For the European Heine, who had long been in Paris, German-style philosophical language appeared generally ridiculous, as it did to Marx. But this is not to say that they engaged in an elevation of French thought or regarded it as somehow superior. The important point is that Marx's break with Hegelian philosophy went hand in hand with an abandonment of Hegelian vocabulary. For example, the term alienation itself, central to Hegel's problematic, remained completely internal to Hegel, despite a Feuerbachian inversion. Even today, we can produce innumerable examples of thinkers attracted principally to the 1844 manuscripts who are inevitably swallowed up by Hegelian thought. What we must be vigilant about is language. It is not we who think, but language that makes us think. This is Marx's understanding in the German ideology. But we must bring this conception further. Simply to be in another country is already something significant. Regarding Descartes, who lived and thought in the Netherlands, Valery writes as follows: in the philosophical profession, what is essential is not understanding. No matter what star he fell from, he is an eternal foreigner. The philosophers must be shocked by the most commonplace and simple affairs. 3. But what Valery misses here is that, in the first place, Amsterdam in the Netherlands was the most developed and advanced industrial city of the age. The qualitative hierarchy of the medieval worldview is now just an expansion, which was not to Descartes' surprise, enabled by industrial civil society. Another eternal foreigner, seemingly shocked by that most commonplace and simple affair known as the commodity, would, as we know, go on to radically overturn that older worldview. Secondly, Valery fails to see that the cogito, in Descartes' terms, is precisely the concept of the grammatical subject in Indo-European languages. When Nietzsche writes the following, he locates in the grammatical system certain tendencies that permeate the whole of Western philosophy, that the separate philosophical ideas are not anything optional or autonomously evolving, but grow up in connection and relationship with each other, that, however suddenly and arbitrarily they seem to appear in the history of thought, they nevertheless belong just as much to a system as the collective members of the fauna of a continent, is betrayed in the end by the circumstance, how unfailingly the most diverse philosophers always fill in again a definite fundamental scheme of possible philosophies. Under an invisible spell, they always revolve once more in the same orbit, however independent of each other they may feel themselves with their critical or systematic wills, something within them leads them, something impels them in definite order the one after the other, to wit, the innate methodology and relationship of their ideas. Their thinking is, in fact, far less a discovery than a re-recognizing, a remembering, a return and a homecoming to a far-off, ancient common household of the soul, out of which those ideas formerly grew. Philosophizing is so far a kind of atavism of the highest order. The wonderful family resemblance of all Indian, Greek, and German philosophizing is easily enough explained. In fact, where there is affinity of language, owing to the common philosophy of grammar, I mean owing to the unconscious domination and guidance of similar grammatical functions, it cannot but be that everything is prepared at the outset for a similar development and succession of philosophical systems, just as the way seems barred against certain other possibilities of world interpretation. It is highly probable that philosophers within the domain of the Ural-Altaic languages, where the conception of the subject is least developed, look otherwise into the world, and will be found on paths of thought different from those of the Indo-Germans and Muslims. The spell of certain grammatical functions is ultimately also the spell of physiological valuations and racial conditions. This much by way of rejecting Locke's superficiality with regard to the origin of ideas. For from the perspective of the Japanese language, for example, belonging to what Nietzsche calls the Ural-Altaic languages, we can easily imagine how difficult it is for Westerners to try to escape the structure of the subject. That comes, in a sense, from its inverse, the experience of modern Japan and its relentless attempts to establish the subject, both grammatically, shugo, and in practice, shutai. 5. In the grammatical structure of Western languages, in which the subject possesses a violent force of restriction, a sentence without a subject is difficult to imagine. It is always haunted by this structure in which the predicate, or signifier, takes precedence over the subject, or signified. To put it another way, the English verb to be presupposes within itself both logic and ontology as something natural or self-evident. For example, in English we can transform the dog runs into the dog is running, resulting in an interposition or mediacy of being in every event or action, and the same logical judgment appears when is taken as the copula, as in the dog is an animal. We might say that due to the grammatical peculiarities of Western languages, logic and ontology have made inevitable the sphere of Western metaphysics. However, seen from the perspective of the metaphysics of money, this is in no way a problem limited solely to the West. For example, in classical political economy, the value of commodity A is this or that. Thus, value is conceived of as essence, being. In contrast to this, Marx reimagines the problem as follows: the use value of commodity B signifies the value of commodity A. Here, being is transformed into relation and use value as signifier takes precedence over value. What I am calling here the metaphysics of money means that it is the money form that itself makes relation into being. What Marx attempted to do on this point is different from a simple inversion of subject and predicate. In the afterword to the second German edition of Capital, Marx famously writes, "My dialectic method is not only different from the Hegelian, but is its direct opposite." To Hegel, the life process of the human brain, that is, the process of thinking, which, under the name of the idea, he even transforms into an independent subject, is the demiurgos of the real world, and the real world is only the external, phenomenal form of the idea. With me, on the contrary, the ideal is nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind, and translated into forms of thought. The mystifying side of Hegelian dialectic I criticized nearly 30 years ago, at a time when it was still the fashion. But just as I was working at the first volume of Das Kapital, it was the good pleasure of the peevish, arrogant, mediocre epigones who now talk large in cultured Germany, to treat Hegel in the same way as the brave Moses Mendelssohn in Lessing's time treated Spinoza, that is, as a dead dog. I therefore openly avowed myself the pupil of that mighty thinker, and even here and there, in the chapter on the theory of value, coquetted with the modes of expression peculiar to him. The mystification which dialectic suffers in Hegel's hands, by no means prevents him from being the first to present its general form of working in a comprehensive and conscious manner. With him it is standing on its head. it must be turned right side up again, if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. 6. However, Hegelian logic, ontology, cannot be overcome simply inverting the subject and predicate. What makes the critique of the Hegelian system fraught with difficulty is the fact that it exists as the representative of a Western metaphysics begun by Plato. Certainly, Marx inverted Hegel, but that is precisely where the difficulty started. It goes without saying that the dialectic is a logic formed through the subject and predicate, but merely saying that the predicate becomes the subject is meaningless. What we ought to question instead is the original binary itself of subject and predicate, signified and signifier. For instance, when Marx emphasizes this idea that the use value of commodity B signifies the value of commodity A, a non-existent value has already appeared. Thus, in this expression itself, value as signified is presupposed in advance. If we are to make Marx's theory of the value form something truly capable of deconstructing the Hegelian dialectic, it cannot simply invert the subject and predicate, but must be read as a question of the origin from which this structure of subject and predicate is itself derived. That is, we must read something that we have not yet thought. Heidegger. He writes, apropos of Nietzsche, and I quote at some length, Nietzsche's philosophy, according to his own testimony, is inverted Platonism. We ask, in what sense does the relation of beauty and truth which is peculiar to Platonism become a different sort of relation through the overturning? The question can easily be answered by a simple recalculation, if overturning Platonism may be equated with a procedure of standing all of Plato's statements on their heads, as it were. To be sure, Nietzsche himself often expresses the state of affairs in that way, not only in order to make clear what he means in a rough and ready fashion, but also because he himself often thinks that way, although he is aiming at something else. Only late in his life, shortly before the cessation of his labors in thinking, does the full scope required by such an inversion of Platonism become clear to him. That clarity waxes as Nietzsche grasps the necessity of the overturning, which is demanded by the task of overcoming nihilism. For that reason, when we elucidate the overturning of Platonism, we must take the structure of Platonism as our point of departure. For Plato, the supersensuous is the true world. It stands over all, as what sets the standard. The sensuous lies below, as the world of appearances. What stands over all is alone and from the start what sets the standard. It is therefore what is desired. After the inversion, that is easy to calculate in a formal way, the sensuous, the world of appearances, stands above. The supersensuous, the true world, lies below. With a glance back to what we had already presented, however, we must keep a firm hold on the realization that the very talk of a true world and world of appearances no longer speaks the language of Plato. But what does that mean? The sensuous stands above all. It means that it is the true, it is genuine being. If we take the inversion strictly in this sense, then the vacant niches of the above and below are preserved, suffering only a change in occupancy, as it were. But as long as the above and below define the formal structure of Platonism, Platonism in its essence perdures. The inversion does not achieve what it must, as an overcoming of nihilism, namely, an overcoming of Platonism in its very foundations. Such overcoming succeeds only when the above in general is set aside as such, when the former positing of something true and desirable no longer arises, when the true world, in the sense of the ideal, is expunged. What happens when the true world is expunged? Does the apparent world still remain? No. For the apparent world can be what it is only as a counterpart of the true. If the true world collapses, so must the world of appearances. Only then is Platonism overcome, which is to say, inverted in such a way that philosophical thinking twists free of it. But then where does such thinking wind up? During the time the overturning of Platonism became for Nietzsche a twisting free of it, madness befell him. Heretofore no one at all has recognized this reversal as Nietzsche's final step. Neither has anyone perceived that the step is clearly taken only in his final creative year. 7. We should be aware that Platonism survives within the conceptions of hidden structure, the base or infrastructure, the deep structure, and so on. Heidegger pointed out such a difficulty, but was he able to cut through the problem with his question of being, Seinsfrage? Where Nietzsche rejected the concept of being, Heidegger recodes and reinterprets Nietzsche's thought ontologically. In other words, Heidegger unfortunately returns once more to what Nietzsche called this common philosophy of grammar. This return shows us precisely the fundamental difficulty. In the end, Marx's inversion of Hegel's philosophy took place through the Hegelian vocabulary itself. However, is it not the case that, in Capital, it is precisely through this loyalty to Hegel that the most effective negation of the Hegelian system, compared to any other critique, became possible? To truly read Capital is to throw ourselves into the midst of this difficulty. Notes Karatani's Marx 1 on Hiromatsu. See the important recent work of Watanabe Yasuhiko, Hiromatsu Wataru no Shis? Nizai no Danamizumu. Tokyo, Misuzu Shab.